three cousins left for what should have been an ordinary weekend camping trip in the remote wilderness of northern Montana. When they failed to return home, their families launched one of the most extensive search operations in state history. For 9 months, not a single trace was found. No tent, no backpacks, no footprints. It was as if the boys had simply vanished into thin air. Then a wildlife camera captured something that changed everything. What the lens recorded deep in those untouched forests would force investigators to reopen a case they thought was closed forever. The footage revealed details so disturbing that some officials questioned whether it should ever be made public. But before we dive into what that camera captured, you need to understand the events that led up to that fateful weekend in August 1985. The Brennan cousins were as close as brothers. 16-year-old Michael Brennan was the natural leader of the group, athletic and confident, with an infectious grin that could talk his way out of any trouble. His cousin David, also 16, was quieter but fiercely loyal, the kind of kid who would follow Michael anywhere. The youngest, 14-year-old Tommy, was Michael's little brother in everything but blood. He idolized his older cousins and had been begging them for months to take him on one of their camping adventures. The boys lived in the small logging town of Cedar Falls, Montana, where everyone knew everyone and kids still had the freedom to roam the endless wilderness that surrounded their community. Michael and David had been camping together since they were old enough to carry backpacks, exploring the maze of valleys and ridges that stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction. They knew the area better than most adults. That's why when they announced their plan for a 3-day camping trip to Whitewater Canyon, their parents barely hesitated to give permission. The location was remote but not dangerous, about 15 miles from the nearest road. The boys had camped there twice before without incident. They promised to check in by radio on Sunday evening and be home by Monday afternoon. On Friday morning, August 16, 1985, the three cousins loaded their gear into Michael's beat-up Ford pickup and drove to the trailhead. Their aunt, Sarah Brennan, Tommy's mother, watched them disappear down the dusty Forest Service road. She would later tell investigators that something felt different that morning, though she couldn't explain what. Maybe it was the way Tommy kept looking back at the house, or how unusually quiet Michael seemed as they drove away. The boys were well prepared. Their backpacks contained enough food for 4 days, sleeping bags rated for mountain temperatures, a first aid kit, matches, a compass, and a 2-way radio. Michael carried his grandfather's hunting knife, a family heirloom he never went camping without. David brought his camera, hoping to photograph the elk that frequented the canyon. Tommy packed his journal, planning to document what he called his first real wilderness adventure. The hike to Whitewater Canyon followed a well-marked trail through dense pine forests and across several mountain streams. Park rangers estimated it would take the boys about 5 hours to reach their intended campsite, a clearing beside a natural pool where the Whitewater River formed a series of small waterfalls. The spot was popular with experienced hikers, but required a challenging climb over loose rock and steep terrain. According to the plan they filed with the ranger station, the boys intended to set up camp Friday evening, spend Saturday exploring the upper reaches of the canyon, and hike out Sunday morning. The weather forecast called for clear skies and warm temperatures, perfect conditions for camping. Friday passed without incident. Saturday came and went. When Sunday evening arrived and no radio check-in came, the families assumed the boys were having too much fun to remember their schedule. It wouldn't be the first time Michael had pushed the boundaries of a camping trip. His father joked that they were probably trying to catch one more fish or see one more sunset. Monday morning brought the first real concern. The boys were supposed to be home by noon, but noon came and went with no sign of them. By evening, worry had turned to alarm. Michael's father, along with David and Tommy's parents, drove to the trailhead. Michael's truck sat exactly where they had left it 3 days earlier, covered in a thin layer of dust. The search began immediately. Local volunteers, park rangers, and sheriff's deputies combed the trail between the parking area and Whitewater Canyon. They found the boys' first campsite without difficulty. The fire ring was cold, but their tent had been properly set up and their gear neatly organized. Everything appeared normal, except for one disturbing detail. The boys were gone, but all their equipment remained behind. Sleeping bags were still in the tent. Backpacks sat against a fallen log, food containers unopened. The radio that should have been used for their Sunday check-in lay silent beside David's camera. Even more puzzling, investigators found no signs of struggle, no indication the camp had been disturbed by animals, and no footprints leading away from the site. It was as if 3 teenage boys had simply walked into the wilderness and disappeared. The search expanded rapidly. Within 48 hours, over 200 volunteers had joined the effort. Helicopters swept the canyon from above, while teams on foot covered every trail, every creek bed, every possible route the boys might have taken. Search dogs were brought in from 3 different counties, but they could find no scent trail beyond the immediate campsite. Days turned into weeks. The search area grew to encompass over 50 square miles of rugged mountain terrain. Experienced trackers found no trace of the boys. Cave rescue teams explored every underground passage in the region. Divers searched the deeper pools of the Whitewater River, thinking the boys might have fallen in while crossing. Nothing. The media attention was intense. The story of 3 missing cousins captured headlines across Montana and beyond. Reporters descended on Cedar Falls, interviewing anyone who knew the boys. Theories ranged from animal attacks to accidental falls to something far more sinister. Some suggested that the boys had run away, though their families insisted that was impossible. Others whispered about strangers in the area, drifters who might have meant the children harm. As summer turned to fall, the official search was scaled back. The families refused to give up, organizing weekend volunteer efforts that continued well into October. When the first snows began to fall in the high country, even the most optimistic searchers had to admit the boys were likely gone forever. Michael, David, and Tommy Brennan were declared missing persons. Their case file remained open, but active investigation essentially stopped. The families held memorial services that winter, though they never gave up hope entirely. In a small town like Cedar Falls, the mystery became part of local folklore. People still talked about the 3 cousins who walked into the mountains and never came back. For 9 months, the case remained cold. Then, in May of 1986, everything changed. A wildlife biologist named Dr. Jennifer Walsh was studying elk migration patterns in the Whitewater Canyon area. She had placed motion-activated cameras throughout the region to document animal movement through different seasons. The cameras were designed to trigger whenever something larger than a rabbit passed in front of the lens, capturing both photographs and short video clips. Dr. Walsh checked her cameras monthly, downloading the footage and reviewing it for her research. Most of the images showed exactly what she expected: elk, deer, black bears, mountain lions, and smaller wildlife going about their daily routines. The cameras had been operating since the previous fall, documenting the rhythms of wilderness life through winter and into spring. On May 18, 1986, Dr. Walsh hiked to one of her more remote camera locations, about 3 miles from where the boys had last been seen. The device was mounted on a tree overlooking a game trail that animals use to access a small meadow. When she reviewed the footage back at her lab, most of the clips were routine wildlife activity. Then she saw something that made her blood run cold. The timestamp showed April 3rd, 1986, at 2:47 in the morning. The infrared camera had detected movement and begun recording. What appeared on screen wasn't an animal. 3 figures moved slowly across the meadow, barely visible in the grainy black and white footage. They appeared to be human, but something about their movement seemed wrong. They walked in single file, their gait unsteady and strange. Dr. Walsh watched the 40-second clip over and over, her hands shaking as she reached for the phone to call the sheriff's department. The figures in the footage appeared to be wearing the same type of clothing the missing boys had been dressed in when they vanished: dark jackets, hiking boots, baseball caps. The height and build seemed to match the 3 cousins, but that was impossible. The footage was taken 8 months after the boys disappeared, in an area that had been thoroughly searched multiple times. If they had been alive all winter, where had they been? How had they survived? And why did their movements look so unnatural, so disturbing? Sheriff Robert Hayes arrived at Dr. Walsh's lab within 2 hours of her call. He studied the footage with growing unease. The timestamp was clear, the location was verified, and the camera had been functioning normally. But what he was seeing challenged everything investigators thought they knew about the case. The figures moved like people, but not quite like healthy people. Their steps were hesitant, almost stumbling. They kept close together, as if afraid to separate. Most unsettling of all, they seemed to be looking around constantly, their heads turning back and forth as if they were being watched or followed. Hayes immediately ordered the area to be searched again. Teams combed every inch of the meadow and surrounding forest. They found disturbed ground where something had definitely passed through, confirming the camera footage was genuine, but once again, there was no trace of the boys themselves. The discovery raised more questions than it answered. If Michael, David, and Tommy were alive in April, 9 months after they vanished, where were they now? What had happened to them during those missing months? And perhaps most importantly, what were they running from in that dark meadow at nearly 3 in the morning? The investigation was officially reopened. The FBI was called in to analyze the footage and provide additional resources. Missing person alerts were updated and redistributed. For the first time since the previous summer, there was real hope that the 3 cousins might still be alive. But as investigators would soon discover, the wildlife camera had captured far more than just proof of survival. Hidden in the shadows of that grainy footage were clues to a mystery far darker and more complex than anyone had imagined. The FBI's Video Analysis Unit in Quantico received the wildlife camera footage within 72 hours of its discovery. Agent Patricia Coleman, a specialist in missing persons cases, led the technical examination. Using sophisticated enhancement software, her team began the painstaking process of extracting every possible detail from those 40 seconds of grainy infrared video. What they found was both encouraging and deeply troubling. Computer analysis confirmed that the three figures matched the approximate heights and builds of the missing Brennan cousins. Digital enhancement revealed details invisible to the naked eye. One figure appeared to be limping slightly. Another kept touching his left shoulder as if injured. The third, the smallest of the group, seemed to be struggling to keep up with the others. But it was the background analysis that truly disturbed investigators. Enhanced imaging revealed additional movement in the tree line behind the three figures. Something else was in that meadow that night, staying just beyond the camera's range. Whatever it was moved deliberately, paralleling the boys' path while maintaining distance. The thermal signatures suggested it was larger than the three figures, and it was following them. Agent Coleman's preliminary report landed on Sheriff Hayes's desk like a bombshell. The boys weren't just alive in April, they were being pursued. The question was, by what or by whom? Dr. Walsh's other cameras became crucial evidence. The FBI requested footage from every device she had deployed in the region over the past year. What emerged was a timeline that defied explanation. Starting in late March, multiple cameras had captured brief glimpses of human figures moving through the wilderness at night, always moving quickly, always appearing to avoid open areas where they might be clearly seen. The pattern was unmistakable. Someone, or several someones, had been living in the deep wilderness throughout the winter months. They moved like people intimately familiar with the terrain, following game trails and avoiding areas where they might encounter hikers or hunters. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to know exactly where the cameras were located, usually staying just outside their detection range. Sheriff Hayes organized the largest manhunt in Montana state history. Over 400 searchers spread across the wilderness, armed with the latest technology and a renewed sense of urgency. If the boys were alive, every hour mattered. If something was hunting them, time was running out. The search teams found evidence everywhere once they knew what to look for. Disturbed ground near water sources, broken branches at human height, fire pits carefully concealed under rock overhangs. Someone had been living rough in the mountains, surviving on their wits and whatever they could forage or catch. But they also found signs that chilled the searchers to the bone. Claw marks on trees that were too high and too large to be from any known wildlife in the region. Strange symbols carved into rock faces, crude but deliberate markings that seemed to serve as territorial warnings. Most unsettling of all, they discovered what appeared to be crude shelters, hastily abandoned, that showed signs of recent habitation. The shelters told a story of desperate survival. Built from branches and pine boughs, they were barely adequate protection from Montana's brutal winter weather. Inside, searchers found scraps of clothing that appeared to match what the boys had been wearing when they disappeared. They also found something else that made veteran law enforcement officers question their sanity. Scattered around the shelters were bones, animal bones mostly, from deer and smaller game. But the bones had been marked with the same crude symbols found carved into the rocks. They were arranged in patterns that suggested ritual or ceremony, as if whoever had been living in these shelters was trying to communicate with something or appease something. Dr. Walsh worked closely with the search teams, using her knowledge of animal behavior to interpret what they were finding. Her conclusions were deeply unsettling. The bone arrangements, the territorial markings, the deliberate avoidance of human contact, all suggested behavior that was part human, part something else entirely. Whatever happened to those boys, she told Sheriff Hayes during a late-night briefing, it changed them. The patterns we're seeing aren't entirely human anymore. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A local Blackfeet tribal elder named Joseph Crowfeather contacted the sheriff's department after hearing about the search on the reservation radio station. He had stories, he said, about the area where the boys had disappeared. Stories in which his grandfather had told him about things that lived in the deep places of the mountains. Crowfeather met with investigators at the tribal headquarters, bringing with him a collection of old photographs and handwritten accounts dating back over a century. The stories spoke of people who went into the wilderness and came back changed, if they came back at all. The tribal name for the area where the boys had vanished translated roughly to where the hungry spirits dwell. According to Crowfeather, the traditional knowledge of his people included warnings about certain places in the mountains where the boundary between the human world and something else grew thin. People who stayed too long in these places, especially during the winter months when the spirits were strongest, could become lost between worlds. They would survive, but they would no longer be entirely human. The investigators listened with growing unease as Crowfeather described behavior that matched exactly what they were seeing in the wildlife camera footage. The night movement, the pack-like behavior, the territorial markings, even the bone rituals. All of it was part of a pattern his people had observed for generations. Your boys, Crowfeather said quietly. They are still alive, but they are not the same boys who went into those mountains. Something has claimed them, and it will not let them go easily. Sheriff Hayes was a practical man who dealt in facts and evidence, not folklore and superstition. But the tribal elder's words resonated with the mounting evidence in ways that conventional investigation could not explain. Something was happening in those mountains that challenged every assumption about what was possible. The search teams redoubled their efforts, focusing on the areas Crowfeather had identified as most dangerous according to tribal tradition. They found more evidence of habitation, more bone arrangements, more of the disturbing territorial markings, but they also found something that stopped the investigation cold. Hidden in a cave system that required technical climbing to access, searchers discovered what appeared to be a crude shrine. Animal skulls were arranged in a circle around a collection of personal items that belonged to the missing boys. Michael's grandfather's hunting knife was there, along with David's camera and pages torn from Tommy's journal. But the items had been altered, decorated with the same symbols found throughout the wilderness. The journal pages were the most disturbing discovery. Tommy's neat handwriting had been overwritten with crude symbols and strange diagrams. The original entries about their camping trip were still visible beneath the markings, but they told a story that made the searchers' blood run cold. The boys hadn't simply disappeared on their first night in the canyon. According to Tommy's journal, They had encountered something while exploring the upper reaches of Whitewater Creek, something that had followed them back to their camp, something that had been watching them from the forest while they slept. The final legible entry, dated 3 days after the boys were supposed to have returned home, was a desperate plea for help. But it wasn't written in Tommy's careful script anymore. The handwriting had changed, becoming wild and erratic, as if written by someone whose grip on reality was slipping away. "It won't let us leave," the entry read. "It says we belong to the mountain now. Michael tried to fight it, but it's too strong. David keeps crying, but no sound comes out anymore. I can feel it changing us. We're so hungry, but the things it gives us to eat aren't foods. Not really. I don't think we're going to make it home. I don't think we want to anymore." Agent Coleman's hands trembled as she photographed the journal pages. In 30 years of law enforcement, she had never encountered evidence that challenged her understanding of reality so fundamentally. The boys had been alive for days after their disappearance, possibly weeks or months. But whatever they had encountered in those mountains had transformed them into something that could barely be called human. The investigation took on an increasingly surreal quality as more evidence emerged. Additional wildlife cameras captured glimpses of the figures moving through the forest, but their behavior became more animalistic with each sighting. They traveled on all fours through dense undergrowth. They communicated with sounds that weren't quite human speech. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to be hunting. Dr. Walsh's analysis of the footage revealed that the figures were pursuing small game with a coordination and efficiency that surpassed natural human ability. They moved like a pack, anticipating each other's actions with an almost telepathic awareness. Whatever had happened to the Brennan cousins, it had given them capabilities that no human should possess. The families struggled to process the implications of what investigators were discovering. Were their boys still alive in any meaningful sense? If they were found, could they be helped, or had they been transformed so completely that rescue was no longer possible? The answers to those questions would come sooner than anyone expected, and they would challenge everything humanity thought it knew about the boundaries between civilization and the wild places that still existed at the edges of the modern world. The breakthrough that would forever change the investigation came from an unexpected source. On June 14, 1986, a fire lookout stationed 12 miles north of Whitewater Canyon radioed in a sighting that sent shockwaves through the command center. Through his high-powered binoculars, Ranger Tom Hutchins observed what he described as 3 figures moving across a distant ridge just after sunset. But these weren't ordinary hikers. The figures moved with an unnatural fluidity, covering ground at a pace that should have been impossible for humans navigating such treacherous terrain. They appeared to be communicating through a series of sharp whistles and clicks that echoed across the valley like some primitive language. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to be herding something ahead of them, driving it toward the deeper wilderness where no search teams had yet ventured. Hutchins watched the figures for nearly 20 minutes before they vanished into a stand of ancient pines. His detailed report included sketches of their movement patterns and transcriptions of the strange sounds he'd heard. When FBI behavioral analysts reviewed his account, they reached a conclusion that no one wanted to accept. The figures were hunting with the coordinated precision of apex predators. Dr. Walsh immediately deployed additional cameras in the area where Hutchins had made his sighting. The new footage captured over the following weeks painted an increasingly disturbing picture. The three figures had established what could only be described as a territory, marking boundaries with the same crude symbols found throughout the search area. They had also begun modifying the landscape itself, creating crude traps and barriers that suggested a level of environmental adaptation that went far beyond normal human survival skills. The most chilling discovery came when enhanced audio analysis of the camera footage revealed that the strange sounds the figures made weren't random. They formed patterns, repetitive sequences that linguists identified as a rudimentary but consistent form of communication. Whatever the boys had become, they had developed their own language, one that bore no resemblance to human speech. Agent Coleman assembled a task force of specialists unlike any in FBI history. Anthropologists, wildlife biologists, psychologists, and even experts in folklore and mythology were brought in to help understand what they were dealing with. The official reports carefully avoided speculation about supernatural causes, but privately, investigators were beginning to consider possibilities that challenged the very foundations of rational thought. The task force's analysis revealed patterns that defied conventional explanation. The boys' transformation appeared to follow stages, documented through months of wildlife camera footage. Initially, they had moved like injured or disoriented humans. Gradually, their posture changed, becoming more crouched and predatory. Their group dynamics evolved from typical teenage behavior to something resembling a wolf pack hierarchy. Most unsettling of all, their relationship with the natural environment had fundamentally altered. Dr. Sarah Martinez, an expert in extreme survival psychology, studied the footage with growing unease. In her professional opinion, the boys had undergone what she termed environmental adaptation beyond known human parameters. They had somehow learned to survive in conditions that should have killed them, but the cost of that survival was their humanity itself. The families received regular briefings from the task force, but the information only deepened their anguish. Were their children still alive in any meaningful sense? Could the transformation be reversed? Agent Coleman was honest about the uncertainty. They were venturing into territory that had no precedent in modern law enforcement or medical science. Meanwhile, the boys themselves seemed to be evolving rapidly. Camera footage from late June showed them constructing elaborate shelters that incorporated architectural principles no human could have learned through trial and error alone. The structures were perfectly adapted to the mountain environment, invisible from above, and strategically positioned to provide both protection and surveillance of the surrounding area. Dr. Walsh noted that the boys had also begun exhibiting behavior that suggested they were no longer entirely dependent on human tools or clothing. Thermal imaging revealed that their body temperatures had somehow adapted to the mountain climate, allowing them to survive exposure that would be fatal to normal humans. Their movement patterns indicated enhanced night vision and an almost supernatural awareness of their surroundings. The investigation took another disturbing turn when search teams discovered evidence that the boys were no longer the only transformed humans in the wilderness. Additional sets of footprints were found near their shelters, prints that belonged to individuals of different sizes and ages. The bone arrangements became more elaborate, suggesting the presence of others who shared the same ritualistic behaviors. Joseph Crow Feather returned to meet with investigators, bringing with him additional tribal elders who possessed a knowledge of similar cases from decades past. Their accounts spoke of entire families who had vanished into the mountains during harsh winters, only to re-emerge years later as something between human and wild animal. The tribal name for these transformed beings translated roughly to the ones who chose the mountain's hunger over human warmth. According to tribal tradition, the transformation was irreversible once it reached a certain stage. The affected individuals would lose the ability to return to human civilization, becoming permanent inhabitants of the deep wilderness. They would form their own communities, following laws and customs that bore no resemblance to human society. Most importantly, they would begin to seek out others to join them, particularly during times of environmental stress when their territories were threatened. The implications were staggering. If the tribal accounts were accurate, the Brennan cousins were not isolated victims, but part of a larger phenomenon that had been occurring in remote wilderness areas for generations. The boys might now be actively recruiting others to join their transformed community, which could explain the increasing frequency of disappearances in the region over recent years. Sheriff Hayes found himself coordinating an investigation that had expanded far beyond the original search for 3 missing teenagers. Database searches revealed patterns of unexplained disappearances in wilderness areas across the Pacific Northwest dating back decades. In each case, the missing persons were experienced outdoors enthusiasts who had vanished without trace in remote locations. Most disturbing of all, several cases included subsequent sightings of figures matching the missing persons' descriptions, but exhibiting the same unnatural behaviors documented in the Brennan case. The media had begun to take notice of the unusual nature of the investigation, though authorities carefully controlled the information released to the public. Official statements spoke only of an ongoing search for missing persons and the deployment of new technology to aid in wilderness rescue operations. The true scope of what investigators were dealing with remained classified at the highest levels. Dr. Walsh's cameras continued to document the boys' activities throughout the summer months. The footage revealed that their territory was expanding, encompassing an area of nearly 30 square miles of the most remote wilderness in the region. They had established what appeared to be permanent settlements at strategic locations, connected by a network of hidden trails that avoided all areas where humans might venture. Most concerning of all, the cameras captured evidence that the boys were not content to remain hidden in the wilderness indefinitely. Footage from early August showed them venturing closer to established hiking trails and camping areas, always at night, always staying just beyond the range of normal human detection. They appeared to be scouting, learning the patterns of human activity in their expanded territory. Agent Coleman realized that the investigation had reached a critical juncture. The boys were no longer simply missing persons to be rescued. They had become something else entirely, something that posed a potential threat to anyone who ventured into their domain. The question was no longer whether they could be saved, but whether they could be contained before others suffered the same fate. The decision to attempt direct contact with the transformed boys was made at the highest levels of federal law enforcement. If communication was possible, it might provide answers to questions that had haunted the investigation for over a year. If the boys retained any vestige of their human identity, they might be willing to explain what had happened to them and whether their condition could be reversed. The contact team was assembled with extraordinary care. Dr. Martinez would lead the psychological assessment, while Agent Coleman handled the law enforcement aspects. Joseph Crow Feather volunteered to serve as a cultural consultant, believing that traditional tribal knowledge might provide insights that modern science could not offer. The team would approach the boys' primary settlement under carefully controlled conditions, using Dr. Walsh's camera network to track their movements and ensure the safety of all involved. What they discovered during that first face-to-face encounter would either provide the answers everyone desperately sought or reveal truths too terrible for the human mind to fully comprehend. As the team prepared for what might be the most important conversation in the history of missing persons investigations, none of them could have imagined the revelations that awaited them in the depths of those ancient mountains. The boys had indeed survived their ordeal, but what they had become would challenge every assumption about the boundaries between civilization and the wild places that still existed beyond human understanding. The contact team established their forward operating base at dawn on August 23, 1986. Dr. Walsh had positioned cameras throughout the approach route, creating a real-time surveillance network that would document every moment of the encounter. The boys' primary settlement lay hidden in a narrow canyon 3 miles from the nearest marked trail, accessible only through a series of rocky passages that required technical climbing skills. Agent Coleman carried a portable radio transmitter capable of broadcasting on multiple frequencies, hoping the boys might still remember how to operate the equipment they had abandoned at their original campsite over a year ago. Dr. Martinez brought psychological assessment tools adapted for extreme circumstances, though she privately doubted whether standard evaluation methods would apply to subjects who had undergone such radical transformation. Joseph Crow Feather insisted on approaching the settlement alone initially, believing that tribal protocols might be more effective than federal law enforcement techniques. His grandfather had told him stories of successful communication with the transformed ones, though such encounters were rare and required careful adherence to customs that dated back centuries. The team's cameras captured their first clear footage of the boys at 11:47 a.m. Michael, David, and Tommy emerged from concealed positions among the rocks with a coordination that suggested they had been aware of the approaching humans long before any detection equipment registered their presence. They moved with the fluid grace of natural predators, positioning themselves to observe the contact team while maintaining multiple escape routes. Dr. Martinez studied the real-time footage with growing amazement and horror. The boys retained their basic human appearance, but every aspect of their posture and movement had changed. They communicated through a complex system of hand gestures and subtle body language that conveyed information with remarkable efficiency. Most unsettling of all, they displayed none of the curiosity or emotion that would be expected from teenagers encountering other humans after months of isolation. Joseph Crow Feather began the approach using traditional protocols his grandfather had taught him. He moved slowly and deliberately, keeping his hands visible and avoiding direct eye contact that might be interpreted as aggressive. When he reached a predetermined distance from the boy's position, he sat down cross-legged and began speaking in the old language of his people. The boy's reaction was immediate and unexpected. They responded not with human speech, but with a series of vocalizations that seemed to echo the phonetic patterns of the tribal language while remaining utterly alien. Tommy, the youngest, stepped forward first, his movements cautious but purposeful. He approached to within 10 feet of Crow Feather and began drawing symbols in the dirt with a sharpened stick. Dr. Walsh recognized some of the symbols from the territorial markings found throughout the search area, but others were completely new. The drawings seemed to tell a story, beginning with crude representations of 3 human figures and evolving into increasingly abstract forms that defied interpretation. Tommy worked with intense concentration, occasionally glancing up at Crow Feather as if seeking confirmation that his message was being understood. When Tommy finished his drawing, Michael and David joined him. The 3 boys stood together, their body language suggesting they were waiting for some kind of response. Crow Feather studied the symbols carefully, then began drawing his own reply in the earth beside Tommy's artwork. The conversation that followed lasted over 3 hours and was unlike anything in recorded history. Using combinations of traditional tribal symbols, crude drawings, and a form of sign language that seemed to evolve during the interaction itself, the boys began to tell their story. What emerged was an account that challenged every assumption investigators had made about their disappearance. The boys had not simply gotten lost or fallen victim to some accident in the wilderness. They had encountered something in those mountains that defied rational explanation, something that had been waiting for them with an intelligence and purpose that suggested careful planning. According to the symbolic narrative they shared with Crow Feather, the boys had been drawn deeper into the canyon by what they initially believed to be the sounds of other campers in distress. Following cries for help that led them away from their campsite, they had discovered not fellow hikers, but something else entirely. Something that had been using human voices to lure prey into the deep places where no rescue would ever come. The entity they encountered was ancient, beyond human comprehension. A consciousness that existed in the boundary spaces between the natural world and something far more primal. It had claimed the canyon as its territory long before humans ever set foot in the region, feeding on the life force of creatures that wandered into its domain. But rather than simply consuming the boys, as it had countless others over the centuries, the entity had recognized something unique in their bond as family. Their loyalty to each other, their willingness to face danger together rather than abandon one another, had impressed the ancient consciousness. It had offered them a choice that no previous victims had been given. They could die as humans and feed its endless hunger, or they could be transformed into something new, becoming extensions of its will while retaining some vestige of their original selves. Faced with certain death, the boys had chosen transformation, not understanding the true cost of their decision until it was too late to reverse. The process had taken months, slowly stripping away their humanity while replacing it with capabilities that allowed them to survive in conditions that would kill normal humans. They had retained their memories and their love for each other, but their connection to the human world had been severed as completely as if they had died in those mountains. Dr. Martinez watched the symbolic conversation with a mixture of professional fascination and personal horror. The boys were describing a form of psychological conditioning that went beyond anything in the literature of extreme survival or captivity syndrome. They had been fundamentally rewired at a neurological level, their basic drives and instincts altered to serve purposes that were no longer entirely their own. But perhaps most disturbing of all was the revelation that their transformation was not complete. The entity required them to prove their loyalty through acts that demonstrated their complete separation from human civilization. They had been given a task that would finalize their conversion from human to something else entirely. They were to bring others into the mountains, others who shared the same bonds of family and loyalty that had initially saved them from immediate death. The entity was building something in the deep places of the wilderness, a community of transformed humans who would serve its purposes while believing they were exercising their own free will. The boys' expeditions near hiking trails and camping areas had not been random wandering. They had been scouting for potential candidates, families, or groups whose bonds were strong enough to survive the initial transformation process. Their enhanced abilities allowed them to observe and evaluate targets without being detected, learning their patterns and weaknesses before making contact. Joseph Crow Feather's expression grew increasingly grim as he interpreted the boys' symbolic narrative for the watching team. According to tribal tradition, what the boys described was the emergence of what his people called the hunger that walks, an ancient evil that periodically awakened in times of environmental stress, seeking to expand its influence by corrupting those who were strong enough to survive its touch. The entity's awakening had been triggered by change in the ecosystem caused by logging and mining operations in the region. Its territory had been disturbed, its traditional feeding grounds disrupted by human activity. In response, it had begun actively recruiting agents who could help it adapt to the changing environment while expanding its reach into areas previously beyond its influence. The boys were not victims in any conventional sense. They had become willing servants of something that viewed human civilization as a threat to be contained or eliminated. Their scouting missions were preparation for a larger plan that would draw increasing numbers of people into the wilderness where they could be evaluated for potential transformation or elimination. Agent Coleman realized that the investigation had uncovered something far more serious than a missing persons case. The boys represented an active and growing threat to public safety, one that required immediate containment measures. But the question remained whether they retained enough of their humanity to be reasoned with, or whether they had passed beyond the point where rescue was possible. The answer came when Tommy approached Crow Feather one final time, kneeling beside the elder and speaking in a whisper that the surveillance equipment barely captured. His words were in English, the first human language any of the boys had used since the contact began. "Tell our families we're sorry," Tommy said, his voice carrying echoes of the child he had once been. "But we can't come home anymore. This is what we are now. This is what we chose." He paused, glancing back at his cousins, who watched from the shadows with eyes that reflected light like wild animals. "And soon, others will choose it too. The mountain is hungry, and we're going to feed it." With those words, the three boys melted back into the wilderness with a speed and stealth that left the contact team stunned. Dr. Walsh's cameras tracked their movement for several hundred yards before losing them entirely in terrain that should have been impossible to navigate so quickly. The implications of Tommy's final message sent shockwaves through the command structure. The boys were not only beyond rescue, they had become active participants in whatever malevolent force controlled their territory. They would continue to lure others into the mountains, expanding their ranks and serving purposes that remained largely unknown but clearly hostile to human civilization. Sheriff Hayes coordinated with federal authorities to establish a permanent monitoring station overlooking the boys' territory. The area was quietly designated as off-limits to civilian access, though the official reason given was environmental protection rather than public safety. Warning signs were posted at all trailheads leading into the region, and ranger patrols were increased to discourage unauthorized camping or hiking. The families of Michael, David, and Tommy were given a carefully edited version of the contact team's findings. They were told that their children had survived their ordeal, but had suffered severe psychological trauma that made return to civilization impossible. The boys were alive but living as permanent residents of the wilderness, beyond the reach of rescue or recovery. For the parents and relatives who had spent over a year hoping for their return, the news was devastating. Their children lived, but they were lost forever in ways that went beyond simple physical separation. The boys they had raised and loved no longer existed except as memories, replaced by something that wore their faces but served alien purposes. Dr. Walsh continued her research in the region, but her focus shifted from wildlife observation to threat assessment. Her camera network became an early warning system designed to track the movements of the transformed boys and identify any expansion of their territory or activities. The footage she captured over the following months confirmed everyone's worst fears. The boys were not content to remain hidden in their mountain stronghold. They ventured increasingly far from their base of operations, always at night, always avoiding direct contact with humans, but clearly studying the patterns of civilization at the edges of their wilderness domain. They were learning, adapting, preparing for something that would require knowledge of human behavior and weaknesses. Most disturbing of all, they were no longer alone. Additional figures began appearing in the camera footage, transformed humans of various ages and backgrounds who had somehow joined the growing community in the deep mountains. The boys had succeeded in their recruitment mission, drawing others into their realm through methods that remained largely mysterious but terrifyingly effective. Agent Coleman's final report on the Brennan case was classified at the highest levels of government. The official conclusion stated that 3 missing teenagers had been located but were unable to return to civilization due to severe psychological trauma resulting from their extended wilderness ordeal. The boys were declared wards of the federal government and placed under permanent protective custody in an undisclosed location. The truth was far more complex and infinitely more disturbing. Michael, David, and Tommy Brennan had become something that challenged the very foundations of human understanding about the boundaries between civilization and the wild places that still existed beyond our control. They were alive, but they were no longer human in any meaningful sense. The wildlife camera that had first captured their transformed state continued to document their activities as they established a growing community of the lost and changed in the deepest places of the Montana wilderness. The footage served as a constant reminder that some mysteries are too dangerous to solve completely, and some missing persons are better left unfound. For the families who had spent months praying for their return, the boys would forever remain as they were in those last photographs taken before their camping trip. Smiling teenagers full of life and promise, frozen in time before they walked into the mountains and discovered that some places in the world still belong to forces older and hungrier than human civilization could comprehend. The case officially remained open, though active investigations ceased. In the files of multiple law enforcement agencies, Michael, David, and Tommy Brennan were listed as missing persons whose fate remained unknown. The truth of what they had become was deemed too dangerous for public knowledge, buried in classified reports that would never see the light of day. But in the remote wilderness of northern Montana, the cameras continued to watch and record. And sometimes, on clear nights when the moon was dark and the wind carried strange sounds down from the high places, they captured glimpses of figures moving through the forest with purpose and intelligence that was no longer entirely human. The boys had found their way home, but it was not the home their families remembered. It was something far older and infinitely more hungry, waiting patiently in the deep places for others to join them in the darkness that lived between the world of men and the ancient powers that had never truly gone away.